Energy expert Clyde Mallinson joins us now to share his thoughts about these developments. A very good evening to you, Mr. Mallinson. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Good to speak to you again this year. Let's just first start with the situation that we're facing. I mean, firstly, the president saying that he's made an appeal to Eskom to hold off indefinitely this electricity price hike. As we mentioned earlier on, some pundits saying that Eskom is under no obligation. And it sounds like Eskom has already sort of ring-fenced the money, saying it knows where it will go and what it will help. What are your thoughts about, the possibility of it happening at all?
Evening to your viewers. My first thought is that I think in your run-up to crossing over to me, it was said that Eskom had granted, or Nersa had granted Eskom the tariff increase. Well, of course they didn't. Eskom asked for 32% and Nersa granted just under 19%. Now, I'm not suggesting that 19% is manageable. But the point to be made is that Eskom got about 60% of what they had requested. As regards the president saying Eskom should keep the tariff increases, should delay or postpone the tariff increases, I think it's coming from a sense of looking to help those who currently can't even afford the current electricity prices. So it's a kind of a, let's call it a pro-poor, pro-small business stance. So one has to effectively applaud the president in his sentiment. But having said that, to make those announcements at a party political meeting, as opposed to through proper channels as the president of the country, and at the same time to say that they must hold back those increases until load shedding stops. It's not fair to have increases with load shedding. Of course, part of the reason for the increases is to try and stop load shedding. So we've got ourselves painted into a very, very tight corner here, where the increases are clearly not to be tolerated by business and by people and by people who struggle to pay for electricity in the first place. But on the other hand, Eskom requires additional finance to pull itself out of the mess it's got itself into. So it wasn't a great announcement, in my opinion. It was poorly judged.
Clyde, do you see the courts being the one to break that deadlock? And is it fair? I ask this, of course, knowing that the DA has approached the courts to call this move unconstitutional, unlawful, and even question the implementation of some of the repeated ongoing decisions by Eskom, particularly that to load shed in itself.
Yeah, look, I think we all, at this stage, if we don't understand it, we should understand it. Eskom don't take any pleasure in load shedding. Load shedding is done for one reason and one reason only, is there has to be an instantaneous balance between what is being supplied to the grid and what is being extracted from the grid. And if you get that balance wrong, either by too much or too little being put into the grid relative to demand, the voltage starts fluctuating, the frequency drops or increases, and the grid actually starts going into autonomous shutdown mode to protect itself. So load shedding has no other purpose whatsoever other than to prevent the grid from failing completely. So it's a terrible, terrible thing to live with, but you can't go to a court and have a judge say to Eskom, you're not allowed to have load shedding. It would be tantamount to the judge saying, you've got to rather allow Eskom, allow the grid to collapse rather than have load shedding. So it's a weird kind of discussion, and the fact that we've got ourselves into the situation is very, very sad, because it's been looming for at least the last 5 years. The performance of the coal fleet has been declining. It's clear that people couldn't afford electricity. We need to be looking at a position in this country where 10 million households that are sustaining at or below the energy poverty level need to be granted at least 350 kilowatt hours a month of free basic electricity. And the impact that that would have on the lives and livelihoods of those 10 million households would probably be one of the most effective ways that we can lift the social economic structure of South Africa, because electricity is an enabler. You heard some of the people on the previous clip. They can't cook their scones anymore to sell. So that whole economic activity is dependent on, first of all, having electricity, and secondly, having affordable electricity. And if you can just get enough electricity to those 10 million households that are on that low energy threshold, where they have some surplus, those surpluses will start translating into economic activity. So we need to balance these two things. And if anything, I would have preferred to see the president saying the increase is staying in place, but there's going to be measures put in place to massively increase the affordability and delivery of electricity to those that are at that energy poverty threshold level.
It's interesting because I was actually just thinking when you were talking about it, how far we seem from the ideal of basic free electricity. But you also have the president at the same time saying that Eskom is hampered from being able to overcome the situation by red tape, and government obviously saying that it's going to scale up the process of issuing permits for renewable energy. But how is that going to change the situation, particularly in the short to medium term, when there is this issue that's being floated of permanent stage 2 or 3 load shedding over the next 3 years? And as you say, it seems like, there's nothing that Eskom can do about it. So is it something that you can say to South Africans, you've got to learn to live with? But I must add, though, that Clyde, as one of those South Africans, the question is, we don't have electricity, but the payments that we make to Eskom remain the same and sometimes higher. So, something's got to give.
Yeah, I've been speaking about this for a very long time, and I don't want to go into all the reasons why we are where we are. I think we all have a fairly clear idea. To be talking about removing red tape now is to be shouting down to the engine room for the guys to change the course of the Titanic because we headed straight for an iceberg. And it's basically, you can't catch up lost time. So we're now in a situation, you quite correctly say, we need to learn to live with it in the same way that when we're resurfacing a road between two towns in the Eastern Cape or somewhere, you have what they call stop-go signs. And you have to stop for 10 or 20 minutes and there's a person with a stop-go sign. I'm afraid we're now on the equivalent of a stop-go sign. We're trying to fix the system while we're still trying to use it. And it's terribly sad because we needn't have been in this position if we had recognized that it was coming towards us like an iceberg.
But the fact that we're still paying the same amount or even more for electricity that we don't get, can you help us unravel this? Help us understand why this is the case, Clyde?
Yeah, when you have any business, you have what's called a fixed cost and a variable cost. So Eskom, it costs Eskom pretty much just as much to run, whether they sell more electricity or less electricity. They've still got all their staff, they've got their head office, they've got their overheads, they've got their debt to pay off. And effectively, when they sell less electricity, their ability to service those fixed costs becomes compromised.
Okay.
So bizarrely, during times of load shedding, they actually receive less income as well because they don't get paid when they're not supplying, but they have all their overheads still to cover. And so one of the odd things is that the price of electricity increases when the sales decrease because Eskom need to get a certain quantum of money or quantum of revenue. And if their sales decline, the only way to get that quantum of revenue is to increase the price.
Clyde, thank you so much for that explanation and sharing your points of view on various issues as well. Clyde Mallinson, energy expert, thank you for your time as always.